Colonialism dominated global geopolitics from the early 1400s to arguably the late 1900s, as the major colonies finally claimed independence from European empires. The kingdoms defended and managed the colonies, often at huge public expense, because they allowed them to spread their influence and values around the world. It also helped that the colonies made huge private fortunes with the trade routes they opened between the riches of the East and the eager buyers back in Europe and the Americas. All manners of items were traded in these years, but tea and spice stood out amongst the rest as some of the most prized commodities that would be ferried back and forth over the world's oceans. The Dutch East India Company, widely considered by many to be the largest company in history, derived 70% of revenue from the sale of tea alone at the height of their power in the 1700s. Entire wars were fought over access to tea and spices, and untold human suffering was caused in the populations forced to grow and harvest something that was only really used to make hot water and overcooked meat taste slightly less shitty. So it's time to learn how history works to find out why colonists were so obsessed with tea and spice. Tropical spices like nutmeg and saffron were prized by wealthy people because they offered unique flavor experience compared to what they were used to in Europe. It's a common misconception that all European food was bland paste before this. Pre-colonial chefs were celebrated for the flavors they could make with things like salt, smoke, animal fat, ginger, honey, and a range of other flavor enhancers native to Europe. It's also a common misconception that spices from across the world were used to preserve meat before the advent of refrigerators. Spices like nutmeg did have antibacterial properties, and it was possible to use spices to cover the taste and smell of spoiled meat. But imported spices were far more expensive than locally sourced meat, so it would have been much cheaper just to butcher a new animal than it would have been to cover up the rotten taste with spices. Covering up the taste of a rotten piece of meat with 17th century nutmeg would be like trying to improve the taste of a microwave pizza by slathering it in beluga caviar. Maybe it could improve the taste, but at what cost? Spices were also not the most effective means of preserving food that colonial Europeans had available to them. That was salting and smoking, which drew moisture from the meat and made it harder for bacteria to grow. The Europeans had this figured out before they even knew what bacteria was. Spices were prized for the same reason we enjoy them to this day. They taste good. Feasts were a big part of high society and diplomacy, another thing that hasn't changed at all to this very day. But when you had royalty and nobility hosting one another, a sort of competition naturally formed to see who could host the most lavish feasts. Today, the rich will one-up each other with fine wines, expensive bottles of aged whiskey, and dinners prepared by world-famous chefs, but back in the 17th century, it was all about giving your guests the opportunity to taste foods prepared in spices brought from distant lands. It was a flex, and people are willing to pay a lot of money to flex. Tea became the go-to drink for nobility when discussing how to rule the world. Tea and spices became valuable because they were valuable. You can't impress your dinner guest with a microwave meal and a $5 bottle of wine today, and nobility couldn't impress other nobles with food that didn't come from across the world. The difficulty in moving tea and spice from where it could be grown to where it could be sold for more than its weight in gold meant that trading posts and shipping routes had to be established to connect the East and the West. Trade journeys were long and dangerous, so sailors needed to be very well compensated, and ship owners needed a big cut because there was a very strong chance their vessel would not survive the journey. If they were lucky enough to make it back to port, the crown would also tax the tea imports. Tea and taxes, I feel like there's a story there. Anyways, big overheads meant that tea and spice kept its big price tag and its prestige. One of the most profitable companies in the world today is the LVMH Group. The letters LVMH stand for Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy, all luxury brands that people consume to impress their party guests. To ask why 18th century colonists were so obsessed with tea and spice is the same question as why people in the modern day are so obsessed with buying overpriced clothes and liquor. It really makes the pain and suffering endured by the colonized populations that much more heartbreaking when you realize most of this was done so that someone could host a snooty tea party. But there is also more to this story. Tea and spice was big business in the colonial world, and it was driven largely by people's need to impress other people. But by the late 18th century, the price of tea had dropped to where commoners could enjoy it as a part of their everyday diet. It wasn't impressing anybody anymore. A funny little story is that high society started using pineapples as culinary symbols of wealth around this time. Pineapples, just like tea and spices, could only be grown in the tropics, but they were even harder to transport because they were perishable. Pineapples were often the centerpieces of royal feasts, with each fruit costing upwards of $8,000 in today's money. It wasn't until the 1900s that a pineapple farm in Hawaii and steam-powered shipping made the fruit affordable to regular people. Nobody would be impressed by a pineapple at a dinner party today, and in the late 18th century, people were no longer impressed with tea either. It had become a commodity. Really, the world's first internationally traded commodity. Because shipping in the colonial era was so slow, it was much easier to make everything locally than it was to trade, unless there was something that simply couldn't be made locally, like tea. Tea and spice wasn't the all-consuming way of life you might have thought it was. The average colonial-era European did not spend their life endlessly working to get their next tea fix. It was a luxury product that the rich and powerful enjoyed for a while before it, if you would pardon the pun, trickled down to everyday commoners. It wasn't so much the spice must flow, as it was if we don't get our shipment of spices, Sir Reginald Snooty Boots will need to postpone his feast. Being in the luxury goods business and the commodities trading business before any other businesses existed means they were incredibly influential by default because there wasn't that much else to go on. Like all businesses, there is competition. Only in the colonial era, some of this competition was settled with cannon fire, which is much more exciting in the history books, so it gets talked about more. So people automatically start thinking about tea when they think about old Europeans. I also don't want to make it sound like tea and spice wasn't a big deal. It was. Luxury goods and commodities are still very important today. Heck, even tea and spices are very important today. But their importance is diluted by all the other amazing things that we buy and sell and trade all over the world with each other. Tea and spice really just paved the way for that. $7.9 trillion. That was the historically adjusted market capitalization of the Dutch East India Trading Company. It was a for-profit company larger and more powerful than most of history's greatest empires. If it was around today, the world's first multinational corporation would have been worth more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and still have more than enough money left over to purchase McDonald's, Walmart, and Samsung. Most companies would be lucky to last 10 years, but the VOC ruled early global trade for nearly 2 centuries, from 1602 until 1799, with an impact that still continues today thanks to its radical business innovations and questionable behavior. But its biggest contribution to the world, if we ignore all the killing, invading, and enslaving, are shareholders. Besides pioneering corporate governance, the creation of shareholders paved the way for modern businesses to become more accessible to the average person. This helped popularize employee welfare like healthcare and pensions, and introduced insurance bonds and joint stock ownership. So, who were the people that owned the most valuable company of all time? How did the concept of a corporation even start? And how did the Board of Investors influence the direction of world history? Chapter 1. Corporate Pirates. The official name was Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. If any Dutch speakers take issue with my pronunciation, please don't throw your clogs at me. For the sake of convenience, we'll use the simple abbreviation of VOC. The VOC was created by the Dutch government through the States General of the Netherlands. The aim? Compete with European powers in the spice trade. From the 1500s to the 17th century, the Western world expanded with the Age of Discovery. Spice routes were big bucks. Empire was big business. Weakening the economy of your rivals would enable you to expand your nation's franchise and monopolize the world before they did. But how do you create a business machine big enough to squeeze the likes of Britain and Portugal out of the new trade routes? To us, the answer is obvious. But in 1602, the solution was revolutionary. Several smaller, competing trade companies were forced to get along under a new name and mission. These pre-companies included businesses which had been sending ships to Asia for at least a decade. They had the experience and skills to fulfill their patriotic duties. They also had special protections. 21 years of monopoly were granted to this new consolidation in a strategic move to stem the tide of infighting. Along with this greater efficiency and profitability came resources to streamline expansions, like quasi-governmental powers. This gave the VOC power to negotiate treaties, wage war, establish colonies, trade posts, and even execute prisoners. All they needed was to secure a foothold in Asia. Then they'd solidify trade relationships, negotiate for best prices, and if need be, have proxy wars with other nations. But how do you fund a business plan this ambitious? The country needed to fend for itself against its imperialistic neighbors, but it'd be a risk to dump all their money into it, especially since seeing any profit would require a lot of time and nautical miles and pirate encounters. Someone had to be the one to come up with the first ever idea for structuring a multinational. Not an easy feat in those days when the fastest form of long-distance communication was a homing pigeon carrying parchment or a guy riding a donkey. Well, it's time to learn how history works as we charter the course of history and discover the world's first shareholders. Chapter 2. 7 Cs in 2 tiers. Funding for the VOC was divided between 2 tiers of shareholders. Of course, they didn't call them shareholders back then. Instead, they called them bevinhabers and participanten. I know that sounds like a fancy brand of aspirin medication, but they were simply names for governors and ordinary investors. How much money you put in decided how much responsibility you had. It was a bold innovation which laid the groundwork for the 2-tier system which we see today, like the dual-class share structures found in Google and Facebook. The governors were usually established merchants. A substantial investment bought them the right to be a part of the decision-making process, which would have been vital given their own experience with trading in boats. Their influence required access to the company's details, like bookkeeping. By comparison, ordinary investors got an ordinary return for their ordinary input. Voting rights weren't given. Company details remained mysterious. Even if you could have a say in decision-making, it would have been worthless without an insight into the company's inner workings. But that's what these people wanted. Like a limited partner in a modern investment firm, all you want is profit. You give your money to help someone else figure out all the hard stuff. On paper, this setup looks like a match made in heaven. Yet, as any modern business-minded person knows, shareholders are sometimes at odds with management. The early days of the VOC were no different. Easily, the most significant case was the Dutch entrepreneur Isaac Maire. Not only did his fights with the VOC lead to eventual reformations between shareholders and business owners, it even led to discoveries. As a hugely wealthy merchant, he started out as the largest shareholder in the VOC. In the end, one of his 22 children became the VOC's chief of Dejima in Japan. And yes, you heard that right. 22 kids. Guess old Isaac also wanted an investment return on his gene pool. Anyway, his fight with the VOC started soon after his own merchant trade was merged with the Dutch government's monopoly project. He expressed his concern that the company's board only had company employees on it. He saw how the company's debt reduced shareholder profit. He noticed how the board was deaf to feedback. He observed how the bigwigs were becoming richer. Then he accused one of the company's ship captains of malpractice, and the company directors of manipulating share price. In retaliation, they accused him of embezzling funds and hiding receipts. Litigation ensued. Isaac lost. He was kicked out of the VOC and banned from trading. However, Isaac got his own back by setting up a rival trading company outside the VOC's jurisdiction. Then, his son Jacob discovered alternative trade routes around Cape Horn. This passage was humbly named Le Maire Strait. It didn't dismantle the VOC like they had hoped, but it did remain an important maritime route until the opening of the Panama Canal. And it highlighted that the VOC wasn't as all-powerful as it thought it was. But Isaac's real legacy was in setting a precedent for shareholder rights. By becoming the first corporate activist, Isaac's drama highlighted a need for big business structures to increase transparency and accountability. This was going to be vital when the VOC's expansion ushered in another radical business structure. Chapter 3. Charting the Chambers. After Isaac's activism efforts, discussions of autonomy and accountability spread across VOC's network. Different cities had its own chamber. Think of these like different offices of the same law firm. By breaking up different regions into chambers, it created a degree of decentralization which allowed for greater efficiency in resource management. 6 chambers existed in total: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Delft, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, and Zeeland, which is now known as Middelburg. Each chamber had its own fleet, warehouse, personnel, and governor. Like our modern law firm example, these governors could exert influence over their specific chambers while adhering to overall policies set by the VOC's central board. Like a law firm, investors bought shares in specific chambers rather than the VOC in general, so returns were based on the profits of that specific chamber. The good thing about this is it incentivized shareholders to make their chambers as efficient as possible. But the downside was your chamber's level of profit could ultimately be affected by elements outside your control. Maybe your chosen chamber simply didn't have the best geography to facilitate trade, or there was a local labor shortage. Maybe you had worse weather or a disease outbreak. Needless to say, not all chambers were built equal. Amsterdam was the real moneymaker. It was responsible for half of the initial capital raised. Zeeland was the second most important, with the other fleets being further down the hierarchy. However, they could still have influence over bigger chambers. Representatives from each chamber would meet regularly as part of the Heren 17. Here, they worked to coordinate efforts by formulating and enforcing policies in what was the 1600s version of a co-op. The exception is they prioritized profit over member welfare and distribution of power. Usually in a co-op, every shareholder has one vote, regardless of the level of investment, but the VOC chambers were influenced proportionally. In theory, an early investor in Amsterdam could use their bigger returns to leapfrog an early investor in a small chamber. But to prevent this going out of control, a new system was brought in whereby normal citizens could get a slice of the pie. Chapter 4. Harboring Wealth. Attracting a diverse investment base was vital for growth. Wealthy merchants were instrumental as early backers, but finding ways to bring in average people would transform the already innovative business into something more sustainable and progressive. Investing was open for all, and it didn't matter if you were a small trader, an artisan, or even a domestic servant. Take Neeltje Cornelia. She was the housemaid of Dirk van O, an early investor in the VOC. For a whole month in 1602, she witnessed her employer doing dealings with the other company directors, including our friend Isaac Maire. Naturally, she was intrigued. It turns out Dirk van O was raising the capital for the entire Dutch East India Company by selling its stakes to interested parties, but this once-in-a-history opportunity had a deadline. The bookkeeper had to finalize the ledger of capital raising by midnight of the final day of the month. Neeltje thought about it for days, but she didn't know the first thing about business. But she didn't need to. As a housemaid, she knew an awful lot about people, so when she saw how other people were behaving, she knew something big was about to happen. As the clock hands neared 12, the bookkeeper heard a knock at the door. The old woman had come to invest 100 guilders into the world's first IPO. How much is 100 guilders, you ask? Well, exchanging that amount into modern dollars is not simple. So let's just say that if her wages were 50 cents a day, then it was more than likely her life savings. The bookkeeper realized he could give his own servant a bonus with a stake in the VOC. He put her down for 50 guilders 5 minutes before midnight. So how much did the housemaid earn? Well, the VOC's initial pool of capital was 3,674,945 guilders. Neeltje had put down 100, which means that she owned less than 0.001% of the company. But that amount of a $7.2 trillion business lands you just under $196 million. You could say this housemaid really cleaned up. But even if she didn't have the money to put down at the final moment, she could have used another innovation. An option to pay in installments were offered to investors who couldn't buy stock straight away. In essence, a person could pledge an investment which they paid off over time. These payment options helped attract a broader investor base. Company expansions were streamlined and the finances were more stable. With the emergence of a modern equity market, other ventures would soon take notice, which led to the groundwork we have today. However, this buy now, pay later model wasn't a one-size-fits-all. Forget a firm or Klarna, where you could pay over 12 months for those shoes that you probably can't afford. Details had to be hashed out between the bookkeepers and investors. Each installment had a payment deadline, but failing to keep up your end of the deal had possible fallouts. The first is you lose your rights for the future shares reserved for you. Other investors deemed more reliable could snap those up so the company could make ends meet, thereby capping your lucrative investment. But the more devastating punishment was losing rights to the shares you already paid for. You'd no longer be entitled to the upside and dividends of the shares that you'd cleared. Your only choice was to beg for forgiveness, work out a new repayment plan, or watch debt collectors carry out your furniture. More than likely, you'd just have the money that you paid refunded. But that would sting, knowing a missed payment was how you lost out on generational wealth. But the social cost could be much more. Once word got round that you defaulted on a payment, your reputation would be tarnished. Merchants and other businesses would be less inclined to work with someone who couldn't keep up their end of the deal. It's not like you could just pack up and move to a city so easily, or head on down to the unemployment office to get your resume out there. That's why some of the buy now pay later investors sold their stock when they saw financial trouble ahead. The first guy to do this was Jan Allerts. He knew he was heading for a rough patch but couldn't find a way out, so on the 3rd of March 1603, he became the first shareholder to sell the rights to his shares. 2,400 guilders went to Maria van Egmont, and a further 600 went to Mrs. van Berossum. The good news was the shares had risen in value since he first bought them. So though he missed out on the big bucks at the end of his investment, he was able to make a nice little profit on his sale. Active stock trading had just been invented. Of course, people sold their stocks when they had an immediate debt to pay. Like when someone on Facebook Marketplace sells a recently bought PS5 because the rent is due. However, Jan Allert's proved that trading stocks for profit wasn't a bad way to go. From then on, shares were swapped in St. Olaf's Chapel or on a bridge by the harbor, right next to market stalls selling meats and grain. Things picked up so much that a few years later, in August of 1611, Amsterdam opened the world's first stock exchange. This new building might not have been a stock exchange in the way we would imagine one in our time, but it opened the doors to a new way to make money from investing. And a new way to make money always changes how business is done. Chapter 5. Treasuries and Treacheries. By the mid-17th century, the stock exchange had become a sophisticated fixture of every financial landscape. Other countries and cities took note of this revolutionary centralized market and set up their own exchanges. London and Paris followed suit, which enabled their local businesses to raise funds faster and more efficiently. Some of the early practices are still around, like buying and selling based on market fluctuations and even the establishment of a regulatory framework. Now investors could diversify their portfolio. You could even become a stock trader if you had the experience, or lack of experience. But growth like this doesn't come without issues. Tension between governors and ordinary investors never fully went away, and the monopolistic nature of the VOC meant there was a limit to the influence shareholders had on its structure and direction. And as the competition continued with Britain's trading company, plus ongoing issues with smuggling and piracy, the VOC did what every company does when it gets too big. It took on too much debt. In the end, debt was being used to finance its vast operations. Perhaps it would have had better luck funding the extensive military and trading network if the executives at the top hadn't been more interested in lining their pockets. Instead, the multinational was plagued with mismanagement, inefficiency, and sluggishness. Its bureaucracy had once been its greatest strength, but now it was its biggest liability. The good thing about being a small company is your nimbleness allows you to react to market trends quickly. But the VOC was too big of a ship to turn around when the tides turned. Trading spices was the cornerstone of the VOC's vast wealth, but now this sector was crashing. The goods were oversupplied and other trading companies were offering better deals. Plus, consumers were losing interest. They had become more interested in the commodities that the VOC's trade routes didn't carry, like cotton and sugar. It's ironic. The money the VOC generated was used by investors to develop industries that led to its undoing. Textiles were becoming the next big thing. The Industrial Revolution wasn't far off. It also didn't help that France had invaded and set up a puppet government. After 200 years as a multinational pioneer, the Dutch East India Company was turning hollow. The doors were officially closed in 1799, 3 years after the Dutch company stepped in to stabilize the situation. Once it was dissolved, the remaining assets were nationalized, including its debt and colonial administration. Perhaps executives blamed external factors, like the Dutch-Anglo Wars. These encounters did cripple the VOC's naval power and trade routes, and the new political allegiances formed through the century did encourage trade through other means. But really, the VOC's downfall was caused by the thing that created its rise: investors. Everyday consumers decide where to spend their cash. If they don't want to give it to you, they'll give it to your competitor. In 1557, a few years before the unofficial Anglo-Spanish War, Francis Drake decided to explore the bank accounts of Spanish settlements in South America. Once he plundered the Spanish colonies, he darted back across the Pacific Ocean until touching down in the East Indies. While traveling through the Molucca Islands, he met Sultan Babula, then ruler of the Sultanate of Ternate, one of the oldest Muslim kingdoms in Indonesia. This guy was the greatest of the sultans, having run out the Portuguese occupants. Under his rule, the Sultanate reached its golden peak thanks to his reign of free trade and access to valuable forest resources. For Francis Drake, the maritime door-to-door salesman, this was the perfect client. After all, both him and the Sultan shared a common enemy with the Portuguese, who were in cahoots with the Spanish. Drake offered his linens, gold, and silver. But let's call it what it really was. Evil thing number 1. Selling stolen goods. In return, the Sultan offered Drake hugely valuable exotic spices, like cloves and nutmeg, but Drake didn't know how pricey these things were until he returned to England in 1580. Investors in Drake's original expedition saw ginormous returns on his haul. Drake had become a celebrated hero overnight. Everyone wanted to capitalize on trade with the far-off East Indies, but they couldn't do that without more naval power. They got that in 1588, when Queen Elizabeth I's kingdom seized Spanish and Portuguese ships and cargo upon defeating the Spanish Armada. These vessels made exploring the world for riches a cinch. But to finish the Spanish and Portuguese off for good, they needed to push their rivals out of the East Indies trade routes. That came easy though. A few more naval battles later, and England had established firm connections. Though, with the emergence of this new market, the stage was set for one company to step out of the shadows to become a monopoly. Chapter 2. The Sinister Start. In 1599, merchant all-stars banded together to create a supergroup. There was adventurer merchant Ralph Fitch, whose 9-year tour of Persia and Mesopotamia was legendary. Next was James Lancaster, who found a new route to India. Stephen Sowami was the mayor of London and a merchant in his own right. Then there was Thomas Smith, another powerful politician. The final member was Richard Hakluyt. He had sailed with Drake, founded successful trade companies before, and was a bigger supporter of colonialism. With their powers combined, they applied for a royal charter. This official decree from the monarch would make them a monopoly. Their argument was that they had the expertise to mitigate risks from piracy and treacherous seas. Consolidating power made it more efficient and easier to compete with other European nations. And their expeditions could serve broad political agendas set by the crown. Some say this shows a lack of spirit for the free market. Personally, I call it evil thing number 2, cheating. The Queen rejected their application. Spain and Portugal were still powerful, so she didn't want to risk a diplomatic crisis or another war. So they did what all budding entrepreneurs do and tried again and again. In time, circumstances changed. Britain's navy became more powerful, and the Protestant Reformation freed Britain from its Catholic ties with Spain and Portugal. Now, the Queen saw the virtues of a state-sponsored business enterprise. On the 31st of December 1600, the charter was granted and the East India Company was greenlit as the world's first corporate raiders. Interestingly, James Lancaster, who captained the first voyage, was born and raised in Portugal, though he got the job because his previous experience in the East Indies provided intel about Portuguese presence in the area. During the trip, the company seized a Portuguese carrack loaded with spices and pepper. This precious booty helped them set up trading posts on the subcontinent to break up Spain and Portugal's duopoly. By the time they returned to England, the Queen had died. However, the newly crowned James I was so impressed with their maiden voyage that he knighted Captain James Lancaster. Sir Captain James Lancaster. But despite these accomplishments and accolades, the company was struggling in the spice trade. Spain and Portugal may have been knocked down a peg, but the big guy on campus was the Dutch East India Company. The irony is that this company was endorsed by the States General of Netherlands, which originated during the Dutch revolt against their Spanish rule, the very same uprising supported by Britain that ultimately led to tensions with Spain in the first place. It's like encouraging Batman to fight the Joker only for Robin to steal your wallet. Even though England was done fighting Spain, they started fighting the Dutch whilst continuing conflicts with Portugal, who were also at war with the Dutch. So that's like you teaming up with Robin to take on Harley Quinn whilst also teaming up with Harley Quinn to take on Robin. Things were getting complicated. All this naval warfare was getting nowhere fast. In order to get an advantage over their enemies, the East India Company needed to set up a foothold. All they had to do was strike a deal. The Mughal Empire reached the height of its power during the 17th century. In fact, they were one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires on the planet. Their influence spanned most of the Indian subcontinent, including present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even parts of Afghanistan. Their heritage was rich, their culture was revered, and their army was feared. But the EIC had a trick up their sleeve. They sent Captain William Hawkins in 1608 to woo the court, which he did by speaking Turkish, a language familiar to the Mughal court. By 1612, a trading post was erected in Surat. Though the initial trading post arrangement benefited the Mughal Empire, it angered the Portuguese and Dutch, whose own trading posts were being undermined. Another competitor on the scene was the Courtine Association of England. They had been given a license by Charles I, the king's dead father, to operate where the EIC had no presence. The East India Company were being squeezed on all sides, first by competitors and now by interlopers, but they didn't want to temper their ambitions. All the wealth made was necessary, in their eyes, for safeguarding their home country against antagonistic empires. I mean, what else are they supposed to do? Make peace? That's a terrible idea. The spice must flow. In the interest of time, I'm going to summarize the next few decades of the story because the conflicts are dense, convoluted, and frankly, bizarre. Just note that the latter parts of the 1600s was a time when the East India Company fought the Dutch East India Trading Company, but teamed up with the Dutch to fight Portugal, who later gave England Bombay when King Charles II married Portugal's Catherine of Braganza. Despite this, the EIC still fought Portugal's merchants for their own political motives, meaning England and Portugal were kinda cool with each other now, but their merchants were not. Things only got more tense from here. Chapter 3. Best Mates, Stalemates, and Checkmates. Things kicked up a notch around 1661, when Charles II gave the EIC rights to acquire territory, mint money, command fortresses, command troops, declare war, declare peace, and exercise civil and criminal jurisdiction. These powers effectively made the EIC a state power on the international stage. This was evil thing number 3. The laws don't apply. On paper, they were a mere private company setting up trading posts. In reality, they were their own militarized sovereignty, operating both in and outside of English jurisdiction. No longer did they need to get permission from back home. Now they had the money and means to call the shots. For example, forts and trading posts no longer had to be defended. Now they could go on the offense. They could hire locals to join the ranks, take prisoners, and elect their own diplomats. That'd be like today if McDonald's sent Ronald McDonald to set up embassies in foreign lands because Canada wrote them a permission slip. Soon their business rivals got their own set of powers, if they didn't have them already. The Dutch and English had a series of fights aptly named First Anglo-Dutch War, which started earlier in 1652, the Second Anglo-Dutch War in 1665 after Charles II made the EIC go Super Saiyan, the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1672, and, you guessed it, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780. But they didn't just fight each other. Eventually, the likes of the East India Company went toe-to-toe with Indian states and provinces who stood in its way. Imagine if today McDonald's had shootouts with Burger King, Wendy's, and Hawaii. The EIC lost Bombay after Sidi Yaqub had sent a fleet to attack in 1689. But then the EIC apologized, so the emperor withdrew his troops. Once they were in the clear, the EIC just set up in Bombay, as well established a presence in Calcutta. All in all, the East India Company and its enemies were locked in a violent stalemate for roughly 150 years. That's a lot of fighting just so people back in London can drink tea. But as always in European history, things took a turn for the worse when France got involved. During the 7 Years' War in Europe, France and Britain used the East Indies as a proxy war as part of their campaign for global dominance. Both had been making sizable gains in the area, but the rise and fall of competing Indian empires was creating political turbulence. Everything came ahead in 1756, when Siraj-ud-Daulah became Nawab of Bengal. Though Bengal was under the Mughal Empire structure, it was composed of different regions, entities, and self-governing groups, like the Galactic Senate in the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Siraj-ud-Daulah was growing concerned with the EIC's increasing military capabilities, so he demanded the British to seize their unauthorized fortifying of Fort William trading post in Calcutta. The Trade Federation, the East India Company, only partially complied with the demand because they said they needed to defend themselves against the French. Turns out they should have been more concerned about Siraj-ud-Daulah, because he captured the fort with his army in June of 1756. I suppose in the eyes of the EIC, he had just proven their point. In response, Robert Clive was dispatched to reclaim Calcutta by force. He succeeded and signed a treaty with Siraj-ud-Daulah. However, Clive was conspiring with Siraj's own disaffected commander, Mir Jafar, to overthrow him. In British colonial history, this was Order 66, or as we like to call it, evil thing number 4, betray your allies. The surprise attack became known as the Battle of Plassey, and resulted in Clive's decisive victory, Siraj's execution, Jafar's puppet rule, and the official start of British colonialization. Chapter 4. Hostile Takeover. By this time in the 18th century, the EIC was bigger than the British government. Back home, the government was taking in about £8 million a year, but the EIC was earning a quarter of that just from their Bengal revenue. When the 19th century started, the EIC's private army was about 260,000 in total. Britain was smaller at 200,000, because they didn't have European officers or Indian soldiers in their ranks. All this, plus a formidable navy, helped the EIC spread throughout India in no time, not just in geographical terms, but also political and cultural. No colonialist worth their salt is going to allow conquered people to carry on as usual. They forced their Indian subjects to get with the program. The EIC imported British values, laws, and principles. Though you could argue this introduced some good ideas, like universities, railways, telegraphs, and cartography. it came at a tremendous cost. Let's call this evil thing number 5, good old-fashioned subjugation. Local and indigenous ways of life were erased. Languages were lost. Traditional cultures and traditions were upended. Religious and social tensions were exacerbated, especially when Christian missionaries rocked up. No one likes a Christian missionary. One of the most devastating consequences has to be how EIC controlled trade. To modernize India, they imported British goods. However, the influx undermined the work of weavers, artisans, and farmers. Poverty started to spread. But the EIC wasn't too concerned with how the economy was affecting others, because they found a neat little side hustle, aka evil thing number 6, literal slaves. Though their buying and selling of human beings was limited compared to the transatlantic slave trade, that was mainly because they didn't want to directly compete. They also used slaves in their own trading posts, particularly as the EIC spread its influence across Asia and African lands, like Madagascar. Servitude went wherever the EIC went, either by force or through heavy taxation and exploitative working conditions. The most catastrophic fallout from this was the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, where an entire third of the Bengal population perished. Though weather conditions had contributed, like a fierce drought, the conditions were worsened by the company's policies and practices. Revenue extraction did not let up in the face of crop failure, leaving very little for the starving population to live on. Land for crops was even reduced because the EIC stepped up its production of opium and indigo exports. As you can imagine, their relief aid was inadequate. They were undoubtedly more focused on the bottom line than figuring out a way to control the soaring cost of basic food supplies. Their indifference continued through subsequent famines too. Though other contributing factors means we can't outright call it genocide, we can call it evil thing number 7, causing widespread pain and misery. Unfortunately, the East India Company still had 100 years to go until it closed shop. Chapter 5, Endgame. After the famine, criticism of the EIC was widespread. In response, Britain passed the Regulating Act of 1773. The design was for the British government to reclaim greater control over the EIC by having a say in their activities. Yet the EIC continued its expansion. Another step was needed. By 1784, there was the Pitt's India Act, which created a board of control to oversee the company's civil, military, and revenue affairs. In effect, the EIC was reduced to a managing agent of the British government. The increase of executives, middle managers, and other proto-corporate tropes had slowed the central decision-making, effectively cutting the company from the inside out. Wait, a company becomes more inefficient the more executives and managers there are? Who would have thought? Don't gloat too soon. Even with this added weight, the EIC continued to expand through war and even annexed whole states. It was too big to fail. The monster was out of control. But not for long. By the start of the 19th century, abolitionist movements were gaining momentum. Though it would still be many decades until Britain passed Emancipation Acts, it was enough for the EIC to start exiting the slave trade. Now, they were weighed down by suits, spread thin, and losing revenue. They were dying from the inside out like a Silicon Valley startup. Then, in 1857, almost 70 years since the British government decided to slow the EIC, there was an uprising. The Indian Rebellion was a major pushback against the company. The sepoys had had enough of economic exploitation and cultural insensitivity. Alas, their resistance was short-lived, but not in vain. The British government saw that the failed rebellion would lead to more revolts. The longer they stayed in the game, the higher the chance of a successful overthrow. It was time to cut their losses. 1 year after the uprising, the Government of India Act was passed, spelling out the end of company rule. In its place, the Brits erected the British Raj as the formal, official, and direct rule by the government. So, the Galactic Empire had been defeated, but the First Order had been created. Cool. Still, it's kind of ironic that after over 200 years of colonialism, the company was taken over. It was dragged back to Britain and stripped of all of its administrative powers. Now it existed in a strictly legal sense. It was nothing more than its name on a piece of paper. When 1873 rolled around, it was time to end the EIC once and for all. The British Parliament passed the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act to dissolve the company. They sat down with the accounting books and shareholders, crunched the numbers, tallied the assets, and wrote some checks. Once it was all done and dusted, the doors were closed on the East India Company for good. Their influence and dominance on international trade finally ended after a quarter of a millennium. Revenge inspired short selling, not a need for market efficiency and liquidity. But some say short selling doesn't even do that. They say short selling only ever leads to more volatility and crashes. They blame the 2010 flash crash on high-frequency trading and short sellers. They say the 2008 financial crisis was subprime mortgages, credit default swaps, and well, short sellers. Is that really true? Was betting against the market in the late 2000s the primary reason shareholders lost $8 trillion? Even if it did, many will defend it. They'd say short selling is the best way for the little guy to stick it to the fat cats. Look at GameStop. They say average Joes pulled a fast one on billionaires by playing them at their own game. Melvin Capital was one of the prominent hedge funds shorting GameStop, but after getting trolled by users on the Robinhood app, they lost around $6 billion before closing their doors for good. That's bad news for the guys at the top, but for the guys at the bottom, they feel like it's justice being served. And it's exactly what Isaac Le Maire would have wanted. He was the guy who inadvertently created short selling when he was trying to take on one of the biggest companies on the planet. But like many guys trying to gamble on the stock market, he should have quit when he was ahead. In the end, he lost everything. Money, family, honor. Or did he? Maybe he did defeat the Dutch East India Trading Company and other too big to fail corporations. He just didn't do it in his lifetime. Isaac Le Maire was a natural-born merchant. When he entered the world in 1558 to 1559, he became the latest member of a merchant family. 3 of his brothers were successful entrepreneurs, but Isaac learned the tricks of the trade from his brother-in-law. By the time he was 25, he had been registered as a successful grocer. His wealth and success would eventually be enough to support 22 children. That's a lot of nannies to pay, diapers to buy, and private education to bankroll. Maybe Isaac's early taste of success inspired him to franchise his gene pool. It certainly seems that Isaac wasn't one to choose a comfortable life. Clearly, he wanted more, even when everything was telling him to play it safe. For example, Isaac grew up in the city of Antwerp in the Spanish Netherlands, or as we call it in the modern age, Belgium. Antwerp was a vital distribution center for Northern Europe. Isaac didn't just have trading in his blood, he'd have it on his doorstep. He was so intertwined with life there that he captained a company of the militia as a side hustle. By day, he was a trader. By night, he was a city defender. At least in theory. That moonlighting gig came crashing down during the Dutch Revolt. One of the defining battles of the 80 Years' War was the fall of Antwerp in 1585. Turns out, Isaac was better at selling fruits and vegetables than leading a militia, judging from how the richest, most populated city in the Netherlands went from a rebel stronghold to being captured by the Spanish. He fled from the northern Netherlands and eventually settled in Amsterdam to raise a family. Many would have taken early business success and a brush with death as a reason to take things easy, but Isaac always had bigger plans. He saw how the uprising against Spain and the eventual establishment of an independent Dutch Republic was ushering in a new era. Whenever there are borders to be redrawn, there is new trade to be found. In the wake of shifting tides, he founded a trading company with a couple of business friends to carry Baltic grains and timber to Spain from Russia. It was 1599, or maybe 1600, depending on who you asked. The company was called the Brabant Company, or at least that's what it would be called once it translated from 17th century Dutch. Other items they traded included wax, fur, and caviar, sought-after goods for high-paying customers. But they also held a major position in the fish trade between British and Spanish ports. These premium ventures carried risk, politically, geographically, and commercially. But to Isaac, there was no risk without reward, and he was right. Their 2 voyages were so successful that the company yielded a 400% return on its investment, but even that still wasn't enough for Isaac to be happy. A new market was opening, one that would be even more lucrative than the trade routes funding the upbringing of the 22 kids. It started with Cornelius de Houtman. He made the first successful Dutch expedition to the East Indies. He pulled it off in 1597, when he and a few other Amsterdam merchants returned with a huge cargo of valuables. Even though this happened a few years before Isaac's company was formed, it's worth emphasizing how information traveled slower back then, especially when it concerned profitable spice markets, top-secret trade routes, and intel on foreign powers. Heck, back then, people didn't even know these places existed. An average person wouldn't be able to independently verify which stories were rumors and hearsay, and which were bona fide business opportunities. In time, Isaac would utilize these channels of communications to his advantage. But for now, let's focus on how Isaac learned that brave merchants had acquired enough maps, expertise, and firepower to break into the emerging market. No way was Isaac Le Maire going to pass up this opportunity, but his decision to go all in had devastating consequences. Not just for his bank account and family, but also for the future of economics and business 500 years after his death. The race was on. Britain had already created its own East Indies trading company in 1600, so Dutch entrepreneurs had to move fast to get a foothold in the East Indies, especially if it was only a matter of time until the likes of Portugal entered the market. Trading companies had to mobilize, and fast. But there was a problem. Growth was impeded by the custom of liquidating a company after a single voyage. Of course, some companies had a few vessels on their books, but in general, the practice was used as a form of security or insurance for the bankrollers. So, in a bid to leapfrog ahead, Isaac Maire merged his company with the same one that had hired Cornelius' successful voyage. This would enable the new company to mitigate enough risk for a few more voyages. However, merging with a reputation as strong as Cornelius's wasn't going to be enough. Competitors had also been merging with each other. Isaac would have to monopolize the Dutch industry before he could even try to take on Britain and Portugal in the trade wars. Thankfully, he wasn't the only one to see where this was going. In 1602, statesman and revolutionary Johan van Oldenbarnevelt set out a bold idea. He'd spent the last few years undergoing special diplomatic missions to King Henry IV of France and Queen Elizabeth I of England. With his inside scoop on rival empires, he was perfectly placed to persuade the 6 large trading companies to amalgamate into one big super company, the Dutch East India Trading Company, or as it's known by the Dutch abbreviation, the VOC. But unlike the British counterpart, it would sell ownership in stock at inception. By using wealthy investors to grow the company straight away and not rely exclusively on state funding, the VOC had a real shot at bringing the idea to scale. All they needed was some rich merchants with some naval experience to buy up some stocks. No surprises for guessing that Isaac Maire was eager to get in on this investment deal. He became the largest shareholder when he bought 85,000 Dutch guilders worth of stock. Today, that would be closer to $1.6 million. Although some think his brother-in-law helped him raise the full amount, he did have creditors, and it would be a fitting way to pay back the guy who got you into the business in the first place. The result was the VOC was capitalized at 4 times the size of the British East India Company. When its 21-year charter was granted on March 20, 1602, it had 6.4 million guilders in the bank. Adjusting for inflation, that's around $125 million, give or take a couple $100,000. From that point on, Isaac Maire was one of the most successful merchants on the planet, and the biggest investor of what was going to be one of the world's biggest companies ever. Annual profit started at 6 million guilders, which means Isaac made back his investment practically straight away. The VOC reached its peak in 1799 with stock worth 78 million guilders. That's almost $8 trillion today. In fact, the VOC was so ahead of its time that the existence of the first publicly traded corporation predated an official stock exchange. Deals were made with the sellers and buyers, announcing prices and solidifying trades with hand slaps and high fives. Before long, commoners were investing in the VOC. As the company grew, Isaac Maire became a governor in the company, which gave him greater control and insights into the running of this money-making behemoth. Unfortunately, Isaac wanted more. Or at least, that's the reason the VOC gave for kicking him out. We can't know for sure the exact details, because each side has a different version of events. Isaac would say that the tension with the VOC started with the expeditions of Wiebrand von Verbeek. In 1602, he led a fleet of 14 ships and 1 yacht. Of the company directors on board this expedition, one was Isaac. Apparently, Isaac saw how the malpractice of the company was affecting the bottom line. He had already been garnering something of a reputation as a corporate activist by challenging the head honchos over their poor management and lack of transparency. But something on Wiebrand's voyage was the straw that broke the camel's back. It can't be verified what he precisely saw that made him feel like he was losing money, but Isaac let his anger be known. In 1609, he filed a petition to liquidate the VOC in accordance with the standard business practice. In response, the VOC kicked him out. His stake in the company and position as governor didn't grant enough voting power to survive an ousting from the board. He would argue that the ensuing litigations were a result of the VOC not wanting to be held accountable for screwing investors out of profits. He was the largest shareholder after all, so it makes sense for this to be his motivation. However, the VOC's version of events is that all these accusations of mismanagement were phony. Their version is that Isaac was caught cooking the books. Allegedly, he had taken expenses without providing adequate receipts. For example, he undertook 14 expeditions under his own accounts instead of the company's, which meant any money he pocketed was embezzlement. The sheriff fined him 1,200 guilders, about $46,000, which became a strong pretext for the VOC to expel him. Not only that, but limits were put on how much of his stock Isaac could take out. As part of the exit deal, Isaac signed, or was forced to sign, an agreement to not become a competitor. That meant he couldn't run a trading company in the East Indies, and certainly not from Dutch soil. He was a merchant banned from trading. For the moment, Isaac wouldn't try to find a loophole, because he had another revenge plan to put into action. His only way to get back into trading would be to take down the VOC and force it to liquidate. His plan to do this was through a different form of trading. If the whole drama started over stock value, then he was going to make sure it ended over stock value. His idea was simple: use the bridge. As a merchant, he was familiar with how the gossip amongst traders had been a fantastic way to gather insight and tips. This time, he was going to use the back channels against the VOC. He hired hoodlums and set up the Groot Company, which translates to large company, and sent them to spread misinformation on the bridge where the stocks were being traded. Rumors included things like boat sinking, attacks by British vessels, and spices being ruined by leaks. This is the first example of a bear raid because he was specifically targeting a company to sink the share price. Maire and his Groot Company crew sold naked shorts or shares that they didn't own, which put downward pressure on the VOC's share price. To explain short selling, imagine borrowing your friend's PlayStation, then selling it for $400. 3 months later, your friend wants it back, so you buy it for $300. So you make a $100 profit. Naked shorts are like that, except you don't even borrow the PlayStation. You just agree to sell a PlayStation for $400 but promise to deliver it later. Then you hope the price drops to $300 so you can make a profit. In this case, Maire promised to sell shares at a certain price and deliver them at a later date, but wanted to drive the share price much lower so that when he delivered those shares, he could make the big bucks. Given all this happened almost 60 years before Isaac Newton discovered gravity, we can cut ourselves some slack when it comes to the definitions. What's important is that by the time anyone figured out the truth, Isaac would have done enough damage to the company to either make his money back or sink his rivals for good. If they'd been stealing from him by overvaluing the stock, then it was only fair that he lowered their stock price to pocket the difference. But this plan backfired, big time. Firstly, the type of investors who'd be on the bridge were the types of investors who didn't care about the day-to-day fluctuations of stock value. All they cared about were the yearly payouts. The types of shareholders who might care about day-to-day fluctuations would be the same governors who knew the books well and had the direct lines of communication to verify rumors. Still, the VOC didn't want to risk any blowbacks, so they announced an early payout of corn. Any investor who might be scared enough to dump stocks was placated with a few ears of maize. So, not only had Isaac helped create shareholding, corporate activism, and short selling, he'd now set the standard for dividends. To make matters worse, the VOC sought the government's help when they figured out what Isaac was up to. During their government petition to ban the practice, they said the real victims of Isaac's conspiracy were not the fat cats, but the widows and orphans who had invested everything they had into the company. It's bad enough having a thieving troublemaker's reputation, but being known as a guy who bullies widows and orphans? Dang, that was going to sour any future business prospects. The government agreed with the VOC, if only because they had a vested interest in keeping the company afloat. In response, they outlawed naked short sales. From now on, the government decreed any speculation against a company's value needs some proof. So now, Isaac had inadvertently created regulation. That's not a bad record for a businessman. Well, unless we count how it financially ruined him. The government ruling meant everyone became aware of Isaac's scheme and kept away. As a result, he lost somewhere between $10 and $20 million. Whatever that is in guilders, it would have been a lot less than what he stood to lose from the VOC lining their pockets. However, Isaac saw himself as a man of honor. Even when he was exiled to a seaside town, he conspired to take down the VOC once and for all. First, he tried to get a freelance gig advising France on how to set up their own East Indies trading company. He knew the infrastructure, the corporate accounting, and the merchant trade routes. But the project with the French monarch never got off the ground. Maybe France thought the market was oversaturated, or didn't want to risk the wrath of the VOC by infringing on their contract with Isaac. In the end, Jean-Baptiste Colbert found the French East India Company, though it's possible he used part of Isaac's initial plans. Isaac's next revenge plot would be his last. He set up the Australian Company, or at least that's what it would be called when translated from 17th century Dutch. By basing the company in the United Provinces, Isaac could argue that he wasn't breaking his competition agreement with the VOC, at least until the VOC got some good lawyers. But direct competition wasn't the main objective. He knew they were too big to take on face to face. What he wanted to do is take advantage of the trade routes. If he could find a safe route through the Drake Passage, then potentially he could devalue the entire company's value in one fell swoop. That way, he would be the go-to guy for all new trade. His son Jacob was put in charge of the expedition and ordered not to conduct any trade when passing through VOC waters, although this was part of a ruse. Isaac knew that the VOC would question Jacob, which gave his son a chance to sweet-talk Governor General Gerald Reinst. Reinst had participated in the earlier Brabant Company, so would likely look favorably on Isaac's plan to find a new trade route. Reinst's support of his old colleague might even sow dissent within the VOC. Eventually, after a few talks and one marriage proposal from Jacob to Reinst's daughter, the Maire expedition was permitted to carry on. Soon, Jacob successfully discovered a way through the notoriously dangerous Drake Passage. To commemorate the success, he named it Cape Horn. But on returning home, the rest of the VOC heard how Isaac had pulled some strings and found some loopholes to get through their territory. After porting at Amsterdam, Isaac's son was arrested and the ship was confiscated. A legal case ensued between Isaac and the VOC once again. But this time, Isaac won. Sort of. The court ruled that Isaac was not breaking any rules by traveling through the VOC trade routes to get to Cape Horn. He also received a tidy compensation and got his ship back. Tragically, this was in vain. Jacob died during the return voyage. To make matters worse, the VOC simply played Isaac at his own game and moved their own ships into the new trade routes. What else could Isaac do? His new venture was nothing compared to the huge Dutch East Indies trading company, and now he'd lost one of his children in his never-ending revenge mission. A few years after this incident, Isaac Maire died on September 30th, 1624. His tombstone reads, "A merchant for more than 30 years, blessed by the Lord. He gained a lot of money and lost it all, except for his honor." No doubt, people of his time contest that final point. Isaac was a privileged man who was never satisfied with his wealth, spearheaded the creation of an impressive corporation, and even resorted to playing dirty tricks when he got bitter. His grudge cost him fortune, reputation, and the lives of countless people, including his son. But some say Isaac did die with honor. Despite his misgivings, sacrifices, and mistakes, he created business practices and principles which protect everyone today. From average Joes investing in companies to regulators holding boards of directors accountable. They would say he was framed by the VOC when he saw them lining their pockets. It was surely the VOC who were robbing widows and orphans. Through that lens, Isaac spent his life trying to break up a monopoly, inadvertently created new trade routes, and even helped form vital legal frameworks to rein in and punish corporate misbehavior.
Money laundering wasn't coined as a term until the 1970s, when the Watergate scandal hit. Since then, the phrase has become a household word, while the crime itself remains a familiar hallmark of criminal enterprises. During the 1990s, the Bank of New York helped Russia launder capital flight when the USSR broke up. HSBC was fined almost $2 billion for cleaning the money of drug traffickers, terrorists, and rogue nations like Iran. Al-Qaeda's financial operations in the run-up to 9/11 couldn't have happened without the help of the United Arab Emirates Dubai Islamic Bank. Allegedly. Even Fortnite isn't safe. After some hackers stole lists of credit card details, they bought in-game currency to sell for real cash. But money laundering isn't relegated to secret boardroom meetings in flashy skyscrapers. Take the US candy shops in London. Over the last 10 years, a suspicious amount of American sweet shops have popped up across the capital, including Oxford Street. As one of the world's busiest streets, the rent here is extremely high. Shops like Topshop, Nike, and Uniqlo have to work hard to cover costs. Yet, similar-looking chains of deserted US candy importers can somehow afford multiple shops throughout the 1.5-mile street. They even operated during the COVID lockdown when other shops struggled to stay open. To nobody's surprise, police raids have uncovered a staggering amount of illegal goods and cash. One derelict shop was fronting up to £55,000 worth of illicit goods, including counterfeit chocolate bars. But where did this all start? How did we get to a world where money laundering is so commonplace that even average citizens treat it like a joke? The origins of cleaning dirty money can be traced as far back as ancient China. Over 2,000 years ago, commercial trading was banned by regional powers, so merchants needed a way to keep their profits from foreign deals during the booming tea trade. According to Sterling Seagrave's book Lords of the Rim, ancient Chinese merchants came up with a few ways to dodge taxation. One was the hawala system, and apologies if I get that pronunciation wrong. It was a semi-certification process where money didn't change hands. In essence, buyers and sellers in different regions would use their local middleman to pass on an IOU. Later, the Hawala dealers would resolve the debts between each other by subtracting from outstanding debts or bartering for things of the same value. That way, no formal money exchange took place, so nothing technically entered the economic system. That's why this ancient system isn't money laundering as we define it today, even though it remains a tactic amongst black market businesses and terrorist financiers, although the biggest flaw is that it relies too heavily on trust between partners. It's no wonder that a new, more reliable system had to emerge. But that way, criminals could ensure they wouldn't get screwed over by their business partners or undercover agents. So when the biggest businesses on the planet emerged, the conditions were right to jumpstart the creation of money laundering as we know it. So let's start by quickly explaining what money laundering even is. Of course, don't run off and start your own illegal cash flow system. This is for educational purposes only. And besides, if they could jail Al Capone on tax evasion, they sure as heck can get you. Money laundering is making illegally acquired money appear legitimate. So whether you get your dough from smuggling contraband, kidnapping ransom, or robbing a bank vault, you have to clean it before you can spend it. Otherwise, it'll make it easier for the cops to track you down. The first stage is placement. That's when bad cash is introduced into our financial system through a point of entry, like a bank deposit. The next step is layering. That means moving the money around to obscure its origins, like wiring funds between multiple bank accounts in different countries, or investing in a legitimate business as a front. The final step is integration. That's when you take out the cleaned money to spend however you wish. For example, betting your bad cash at a casino and then walking out with a payday of clean bills, or investing in real estate to convert your illegitimate cash into a legitimate asset. Integration is key. That's how criminals get their cash past authorities. Fail at this stage, and it's straight to prison. That's because, despite the complexities behind cleaning cash, spotting a money laundering operation is fairly simple. Just look out for the sudden, unexplainable displays of wealth. The reason every first-time low-IQ criminal gets busted is that he is suddenly driving a convertible when just last week he was begging to borrow bus fare. Learning these lessons was the trick needed to launder money during the Age of Discovery. It was these traders who perfected the art of cleaning cash. Without them, the con would never have evolved beyond the humble beginnings of ancient Chinese merchants. So while Britain and Denmark's East India companies were killing each other over trade routes, their merchants were working together to create a nice side hustle. Yet when their bosses found out, business sometimes improved. It turns out that having your employees launder money can be good for your company. It can even be good for your country. The French Revolution was funded in part by money laundering during its broke period, so if it wasn't for some guy in tights figuring out a better way to dodge tax, then we wouldn't have modern Western democracy. So how did the spice trade merchants create money laundering? And were the billion-dollar companies in on the scam or just turning a blind eye? The Dutch and British East India companies were nation-sanctioned monopolies set up to give their respective homeland a competitive edge in the emerging spice trade. Technology had improved so much that navigating vast distances was much easier. Hauling back luxury goods from new lands and new allies was a gold rush. Countries pivoted to economics as a path to world dominance, which meant naval merchants were more important than military generals. In fact, these private companies were so large that they had their own military generals. Under the company's unique deals with their countries, the traders could erect forts, go to war, and sign deals with foreign rulers and landowners. It would be like if Amazon signed a deal with the US to become its own nation-state where it worked on behalf of the White House. That way, if Amazon's private army had a skirmish with the sovereign state of Alibaba, neither the US nor China would be drawn into a war, even though both corporations were fighting for the explicit interests of their respective governments. With this kind of power, technology, and accountability, the British and Dutch East India companies were raking in a lot of cash, as were the employees. An office clerk's annual salary would be about $28,000 in today's money. That might not cover all of our modern costs, but at that time it offered a good life. Moreover, your income and pension rose with every year of employment. By 1840, a company clerk could be taking home about 12 times more than a manual labourer. So long as you were fine copying out documents by hand multiple times and losing sleep from the stress of a simple data error getting you reprimanded, it wasn't a bad gig to have. Yet the company directors had meagre earnings by comparison. Despite helping run a multi-billion-dollar company, salaries could be between $300,000 and $500,000. That's not a bad income for the average person, but a fat cat in a successful Silicon Valley tech company would be making that every week. Not that company directors minded. They preferred it this way. Gifts from people desperate to ingratiate themselves into the money-making machine were just one perk of being a big cheese. So why would you want to get a bigger salary just to pay more tax when you could simply be gifted tax-free money and goods every day? This system of under-the-table transaction was inevitable, given how people needed to be nominated by a director before they could be considered for a job. Getting hired wasn't as straightforward as sending in a resume or having an uncle set you up with an entry position. Even after the board nominated you, they needed proof that they could trust you. Every new hire was expected to put down a good behaviour bond of what would today be worth around $51,000. That's a lot of cash just to stack shelves in the warehouse. And the higher the position, the higher the bond. Back in the 1680s, the president of an overseas factory had to fork up about $360,000 just to have the privilege of earning a salary. But it was money well spent. These corporations were making billions, so it'd all work out once you got a seat at the table. If you couldn't afford the sign-up costs, there were unpaid internships to get your foot in the door. They lasted 5 years. By 1778, internships were only 3 years long, though it wasn't until the start of the 1800s that an intern would get a bit of a salary. But once you were in, it was all free training, free drinks, free food, and even nap rooms, like an 18th century version of Google. However, the biggest perk was private trade. Usually it was prohibited given the company's strict orders to run and maintain a monopoly. Yet, employees enjoyed the opportunities to privately trade luxuries far away from the reach of tax collectors. After all, if you had paid so much just to get into the company, it was only fair you supplemented your income with a little private commercial trading, am I right? The thing is, sometimes the company would come down hard on employees doing under-the-table deals. Sometimes people were punished just as a PR stunt. It had to be, given how widespread corruption was. Only rich people could reach the higher ranks of the company. And also, because the company had so much power overseas, that removing a political figure could be devastating. This meant the culture inside the East India trading companies was fine with private trading, so long as you didn't get caught. Imagine that, a multi-billion-dollar financial institution where crime is treated better than negative press. This was why employees didn't petition for a bigger slice of the pie. The real money was in entrepreneurship. Take Robert Clive, British officer, colonial administrator, and, worst of all, politician. He started as a clerk for the British East India Trading Company, then climbed the ranks to eventually help establish British control over India following his decisive victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Yet somehow, the guy helping to oversee some of the most profitable trade routes was amassing a personal fortune that was much, much larger than his company salary. We're talking everything from purchasing estates, building mansions, buying himself a seat in government, and splashing out on a luxurious lifestyle for his whole family. He also bought a lot of mirrors for some reason. If you've got an illegal fortune burning a hole in your pocket, you have to spend it on something. Historians estimate that he left India with about £500,000. That kind of cash in the 1750s meant he was one of the richest people in Europe. Depending on which economist you ask, the money he was bringing back was equivalent to between £6 to £8 million, although some estimates suggest it could have been as high as £200 million. It's difficult to know for sure. He was well connected with a lot of loyal men and in charge of a lot of ships, but that's partly why people became suspicious in the first place. 2 parliamentary committees uncovered corruption amongst his servants, which quickly led to exposing Clive as the head of the whole operation. Thankfully for him, his passionate defence in Parliament and respected military victories got him acquitted. Or maybe it was the fact that the courts couldn't decisively prove how he was moving money. Faking invoices was a common practice. But it was clear now to merchants that if a senior member could narrowly avoid trouble, then they'd all need to get much smarter in concealing their ill-gotten gains. They could no longer smuggle gold in the sailors' bedrolls or the false bottoms of trunks. They couldn't depend on bribing a dockhand to let your ship pass through with a cargo hold filled with contraband. It was time to get smart. It was time for money laundering. But not many people knew that a merchant called Thomas Pitt had already elevated money laundering into an art form at the start of the century. His process would remain shrouded in mystery for years to come, but when it was exposed, it was clear that the kinks of money laundering had been worked out. Pitt showed that there was a simpler way to protect your treasure. He was born in Dorset in 1653. By the time he started his career in 1674, the British East India Company had been operating for decades. After a stint in India at their behest, he ignored company orders to return home so that he could stay in Asia to trade privately. When he did land back on British soil, he was promptly fined £400 for interloping. This fine was nothing, though. Pitt had already accumulated a nice fortune and could have retired early if he wanted. So despite promising not to go against the EIC's monopoly, he returned to Asia to trade some more. Over there, silver could get a lot more than back home, so buying up luxury goods was a cinch. He loaded up boats with illegal cargoes of tea, pepper and porcelain. An arrest warrant was issued when he landed back in 1698, but he'd already left for another trading expedition by the time authorities caught up with him. This cat-and-mouse chase came to an abrupt end when the EIC faced fresh competition from emerging companies. In a likely bid to utilise his expertise and cunning, Pitt was hired by the very company trying to arrest him. They knew he was hustling on the side, but decided to overlook this forbidden behaviour because they had bigger fish to fry. When Pitt arrived in Madras, he'd become president of the East India Company, or at least the president of the Madras province. This position made it far easier to continue his private trade, but it also brought in new problems. Pitt had a front row seat to the diamond trade. He figured that if he could clean his money through a diamond purchase, then he'd have a simpler way of transporting his fortune back home. He wouldn't have to worry about the logistics of transporting cargo or paying kickbacks to a network of accomplices. With a streamlined system, there'd be less risk of exposure and an easier way to obfuscate financial transactions. However, diamonds are a risky business. Hard-to-see blemishes can devalue a stone in an instant, and buyers and sellers are always trying to pull a fast one on each other. But Pitt decided to risk it all. If he could find a good price on one, then he'd be able to smuggle his fortune back easily because the EIC would be concentrating on cargo holds and spices. After years of waiting, he finally caught wind of a special diamond. Legend had it that a slave originally discovered the shiny stone and tried to barter his freedom with it, but the slave master killed him and kept the diamond for himself. Pitt tracked down the stone's current owner and saw it with his own eyes. 410 carats and 85 grams, a beauty. It's not often you can hold generational wealth in the palm of your hands. Despite trepidation from his diamond expert back home, Pitt snapped it up for about £20,400. Adjusting for inflation, that would be around 3.75 million. He hid it in his son's shoe and sent him back to England. Once it was safe, he paid a guy the equivalent of £1 million in modern cash to cut the diamond. When it was ready, he only needed to sell it to the highest bidder, and voila, his vast fortune of dirty money would be clean. Pitt had just created placement and layering. With a buyer, he'd create integration. The problem was Europe was at war, so even the rich elites had to tighten the purse strings. He sat on this diamond for 15 long years. He must have spent that time hoping the EIC wouldn't catch wind of his plan or suddenly decide to arrest him for his previous private trading. Then in 1717, Philippe II, a French regent to Louis XV, bought Pitt's diamond for £135,000. That's a profit of 1,009. Adjusting for inflation, Pitt netted just over £19 million tax-free. It was official. The best strategy wasn't smuggling back gold coins or forging paperwork for trunks of spices. It was converting it into an asset. It was about finding a way to legitimize the money. Now, the diamond is known as the Regent Diamond. It was added to the French crown jewels and owned by the likes of Marie Antoinette. When the French revolutionaries stole it, they used it as collateral for loans. Napoleon did the same thing too when his empire needed a cash injection. Nowadays, the Regent Diamond is on display at the Louvre with an estimated value of $48 million. So even though the likes of the EIC and the VOCC are no more, the thing that outlasted their empires wasn't the trade routes maintained by their generals, but the craft of money laundering created by their merchants.